The morning of February 16th, 1944, 32.6 kilometers off Truk Atoll in the Caroline Islands. Through the grey haze of early Pacific dawn, a Japanese destroyer captain stood frozen at his optical rangefinder. His vessel, the Nowaki, was attempting to escape the American carrier strikes that had just devastated the anchorage. Then he saw them. Two massive silhouettes on the horizon, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even at this impossible distance. American battleships, Iowa class. What happened next would shatter everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught him about surface warfare. The American ships opened fire at 35,700 yards, nearly 20 miles. The shells screamed overhead, bracketing Nowaki with towering columns of water. The captain's rangefinder operators reported frantically, their voices rising in disbelief. The enemy was hitting near them from beyond visual horizon. From a range where Japanese optics could barely resolve the targets, where their own guns would be firing blind, the Americans were placing 2,700-pound shells with terrifying precision. This was USS Iowa and USS New Jersey, and in that moment, every assumption about naval gunnery that Japanese battleship crews had trained for their entire careers began to crumble. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For decades, Japanese naval planning had centered on a single fundamental belief, the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. It was more than strategy. It was the foundation of everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had built since 1905. The doctrine traced its origins to the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in the straits between Korea and Japan. In that single crushing engagement, a smaller but superior Japanese force had demonstrated that wars could be won not through gradual attrition, but through one perfectly executed decisive battle. The lesson seemed clear. Build the most powerful battleships, train your crews to perfection in optical gunnery, draw the enemy fleet across the vast Pacific until they were exhausted, far from their bases, low on fuel and ammunition, then destroy them in one climactic engagement that would force a negotiated peace. Japan couldn't match America's industrial capacity, but they didn't need to. One battle, one overwhelming victory. That was the path to survival. By the late 1930s, this doctrine had crystallized into steel and ambition. The Yamato-class battleships, 72,000 tons of armor and firepower, 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship. Each shell weighed 3,220 pounds and could travel 42 kilometers. These weren't just ships, they were the physical embodiment of Kantai Kessen, symbols of Japanese technological and martial superiority. The crews who manned these leviathans trained under a specific set of assumptions. Japanese optical rangefinders were the finest in the world. Their gunnery doctrine emphasized closing to medium ranges, around 20,000 yards, where their superior optics and crew training would deliver decisive hits. Their fire control systems, while manually intensive, were sophisticated. The Type 92 Shagekiban computer, combined with precise optical measurements from stereoscopic rangefinders, could calculate firing solutions with impressive accuracy. In daylight, at visible ranges, against targets they could see. Japanese naval academies screened recruits specifically for exceptional eyesight and mathematical ability. If you tested well in either category, you found yourself in a gunnery plotting room. These weren't random assignments. They were the foundation of Japanese naval confidence. Their crews could see farther, calculate faster, and hit harder than any opponent. At least, that's what years of doctrine and training had promised. By 1941, when the Yamato entered service 9 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese battleship crews carried another assumption. American battleships would be slower, less maneuverable, and crucially, they would fight on Japanese terms. The Kantai Kessen doctrine predicted that American ships would lumber across the Pacific in a predictable offensive, giving Japanese forces time to choose the battlefield, to position their superior battleships, to engage in daylight at ranges where optical fire control reigned supreme. But something had changed in American naval thinking, something Japanese intelligence had only partially grasped. In March of 1938, following Japan's withdrawal from the League of Nations and its renunciation of all naval treaty obligations, American designers began work on a new type of battleship, not just larger, not just more heavily armed, something fundamentally different. A fast battleship that could keep pace with aircraft carriers while still delivering battleship-level firepower. The Iowa class was born from a specific operational requirement. By 1939, American war planners recognized that the Pacific War would be dominated by carrier task forces, but carriers were vulnerable to surface attack. The older American battleships, capable of only 27 knots, couldn't keep up. They would lag behind, unable to screen the fast carriers from Japanese surface threats. The solution was radical. Build battleships that could sprint at 33 knots. Make them long and sleek, 860 feet from bow to stern. Give them enough armor to shrug off enemy fire, but shape the hull to cut through water with minimal drag. And arm them with 9 16-inch 50 caliber Mark 7 guns that could hurl shells beyond the horizon. The technical specifications told only part of the story. Each Iowa displaced 45,000 tons at standard load, swelling to nearly 60,000 when fully fueled and armed. 8 Babcock and Wilcox boilers fed 4 General Electric steam turbines, generating 212,000 shaft horsepower. This was power on a scale that transformed the fundamental equation of naval warfare. A battleship that could run down cruisers, a fortress that moved like a destroyer. But the real revolution wasn't visible in the hull or the engines. It was in the fire control tower rising above the main deck, the Mark 38 gunfire control system. 2 complete and independent systems, forward and aft, each with its own director, plotting room, and interconnected data transmission equipment. The directors were equipped with optical sights and Mark 48 rangefinders, but mounted on top, looking almost like an afterthought, was something that would redefine naval gunnery forever. The Mark 8 fire control radar. This wasn't just a ranging device, it was a complete paradigm shift. The radar could track targets in darkness, fog, or beyond visual horizon. It fed range and bearing data directly into the Mark 8 Rangekeeper, an electromechanical analog computer that calculated firing solutions in near real time. The system incorporated remote power control, meaning guns automatically tracked targets without manual adjustment. Gyroscopic stable vertical elements meant the system could maintain a firing solution even while the ship maneuvered at high speed. In practical terms, an Iowa-class battleship could detect a target at 45,000 yards using radar, track it through the Mark 38 director, calculate a firing solution accounting for target speed, bearing, range rate, wind, temperature, and Earth's rotation, and deliver 9 16-inch shells with precision that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier, all without ever visually sighting the target. The Japanese had radar. The Type 21 surface search set entered service on battleships Issei and Hyuga in April of 1942. The Type 22 followed, with better range accuracy. But Japanese radar wasn't integrated into fire control. It was an aid, a supplement to optical systems. Radar operators manually input bearing and range data into the fire control computers. The targeting itself still relied on optical rangefinders and human calculation. This wasn't a minor difference. It was the gap between 2 fundamentally different philosophies of naval warfare. American fire control was automated, integrated, and designed for beyond visual range combat. Japanese fire control was manual, optical, and optimized for traditional battleship duels at medium range in daylight. Both systems could work, but only one would work at 35,000 yards in haze, at night, or when the enemy was nothing more than a radar contact on a scope. By late 1943, Japanese naval intelligence was piecing together concerning reports. American battleships were appearing in unusual configurations, fast enough to escort carriers, long, sleek profiles that didn't match the stocky proportions of the North Carolina or South Dakota classes. Submarine commanders reported enemy battleships maintaining speeds over 30 knots, something that shouldn't have been possible for ships that size. The first confirmed sighting came during the Marshall Islands campaign. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey were spotted operating with carrier task groups, keeping pace with the flat tops as they raced across the Pacific. Japanese observers noted the unusual silhouettes, the length, the speed, the way these ships didn't lag behind the carriers but prowled alongside them like predators. Intelligence briefings in Tokyo described them as fast battleships, a category Japanese doctrine hadn't fully considered. The implications were troubling. If American battleships could keep pace with carriers, they couldn't be isolated, they couldn't be outmaneuvered. The entire Kantai-Kessen assumption of drawing enemy capital ships away from their escorts began to look flawed, but the real shock came from reports of nighttime bombardments and long-range gunnery. Japanese shore observers on Kwajalein and Eniwetok atolls reported massive shell impacts from distances that seemed impossible. 16-inch rounds falling with precision from beyond the visible horizon. In some instances, shells landed accurately in complete darkness, with no visible muzzle flashes to betray the firing ship's position. One Japanese artillery officer, interrogated after the war, described it as thunder from invisible gods. The shells simply arrived, devastating coastal defences, with no warning and no visible source. Traditional counter-battery fire was impossible. You couldn't shoot back at what you couldn't see. The technological gap was widening, but Japanese commanders didn't yet understand how wide. February of 1944 brought the moment of revelation. Operation Hailstone, the massive American carrier strike against Truk Atoll, Japan's primary forward naval base in the Central Pacific. As American carrier aircraft pounded the anchorage, several Japanese ships attempted to escape to the north. Among them was the light cruiser Katori and the destroyer Nowaki. USS Iowa and USS New Jersey had detached from the carrier screen specifically to conduct an anti-shipping sweep. Their mission was to intercept and destroy any Japanese vessels attempting to flee. At dawn on February 16th, radar operators on both battleships acquired contacts. Range, 36,000 yards. Bearing, north-northwest. The gun directors swiveled. Fire control radars locked on. The Mark 8 range keepers spun through their calculations. Wind speed, air temperature, target bearing and range rate. Ballistic coefficients for the 2,700-pound Mark 8 armor-piercing shells. At 0936, both battleships opened fire. The shells arced through the morning sky, reaching apexes several miles high before plunging down toward targets the gun crews had never visually seen. Aboard Nowaki, the first salvo landed close enough to drench the destroyer in spray. The captain ordered evasive maneuvers, full speed, desperate zigzagging to throw off the American targeting. It didn't help. The American fire control systems were tracking not just current position, but rate of change. Every turn Nowaki made was calculated into the firing solution. The radar painted a continuous picture. The range keepers adjusted. The guns elevated and traversed automatically. Salvo after salvo walked closer. Near misses became straddles. The massive shells, each weighing as much as a small car, threw up geysers of water that towered hundreds of feet. The concussion alone was devastating. Even near misses could buckle hull plates, rupture seals, cause internal damage that weakened a ship's integrity. Katori wasn't as lucky as Nowaki. The American battleships shifted fire, and within minutes, the light cruiser was burning. Hit after hit from 16-inch armor-piercing shells ripped through her relatively thin armor. She was doomed. Iowa and New Jersey also helped sink the destroyer Maikaze and the auxiliary cruiser Akagi Maru in the same engagement. Nowaki survived, but only by executing radical evasive maneuvers and benefiting from smoke and distance. Her captain filed a report that would circulate through Japanese Naval Command. The Americans had achieved what should have been impossible: accurate gunnery at extreme range, far beyond optical capability, against maneuvering targets. This wasn't luck. This was systematic technological superiority. The Battle of Truk became a case study in Japanese naval circles. Not for what the carriers had done, that was expected, but for what the battleships had demonstrated. USS Iowa and New Jersey had set a record, the longest range straddle in naval history, 35,700 yards, 32.6 kilometers. For context, the effective range of Yamato's massive 18.1-inch guns was about 42,000 meters under ideal conditions. But effective range and accurate range were very different concepts. Yamato's optical fire control could achieve precision hits at perhaps 25,000 yards in perfect daylight visibility. Beyond that, it became increasingly difficult to spot fall of shot, to correct for errors, to maintain an accurate firing solution. The Iowa-class battleships, with their radar fire control, had just demonstrated accurate shooting at ranges where Japanese systems would have been effectively blind. Japanese naval staff officers analyzing the truck engagement began to grasp the implications. The Americans weren't just building bigger ships, they were building ships with fundamentally different capabilities. Ships that could see in the dark, ships that could hit targets beyond the horizon, ships that operated on principles Japanese doctrine hadn't prepared for. A memo from a senior Japanese naval intelligence officer, discovered in post-war archives, noted with unusual frankness, "The enemy possesses gunnery capabilities that exceed our tactical assumptions. Recommendation: urgently assess American fire control systems and radar. Integration." But by February of 1944, it was already too late for urgent assessments to change the course of the war. The Iowa class represented something more than just advanced technology. They represented American industrial capacity and systematic innovation working at scales Japan couldn't match. Each battleship cost approximately $100 million. 4 were completed during the war: Iowa in February 1943, New Jersey in May 1943, Missouri in June 1944, Wisconsin in April 1944. 2 more, Illinois and Kentucky, were laid down but never completed. The hulls were scrapped. America could afford to leave battleships unfinished. Japan had strained every resource to build just 2 Yamato-class ships. The difference wasn't just in how many ships each nation could build. It was in how those ships were designed, equipped, and employed. American battleships carried enormous stocks of ammunition. They could fire day after day without running low. Their supply chains stretched back across the Pacific to ammunition depots that could produce shells by the thousands. Japanese battleships, for all their impressive armor and firepower, were constrained by logistics, limited ammunition stocks, fewer spare parts, less robust supply infrastructure. Yamato and Musashi spent much of the war in port, partly because Japanese commanders considered them too valuable to risk, but partly because the logistics of keeping them operational and supplied in extended campaigns was challenging. The Iowa-class battleships had no such constraints. They were designed for sustained operations across the vast Pacific. Fuel capacity gave them range exceeding 15,000 nautical miles. Supply ships could rearm and refuel them at sea. They could bombard shore targets for days, fire thousands of shells, and still have ammunition to spare. This was total war on an industrial scale that Japan simply couldn't match. By mid-1944, Japanese battleship crews were beginning to hear disturbing stories from survivors of various engagements. American ships firing in complete darkness with uncanny accuracy, shore bombardments that obliterated prepared defenses without the firing ships ever coming into visual range, 16-inch shells landing with precision that suggested the Americans could see through clouds, fog, and night. For men trained in traditional optical gunnery, these reports were difficult to process. Naval combat was supposed to be about crew skill, about the quality of your rangefinders, about the training of your gunners. The idea that the enemy could simply bypass all of that with electronic systems felt almost like cheating, but it wasn't cheating. It was evolution, and Japanese naval doctrine hadn't evolved fast enough. The fundamental problem was philosophical. Japanese naval planning had focused on building ships capable of winning a decisive battle under specific conditions. The Kantai Kessen envisioned a grand fleet engagement, perhaps at dawn or dusk, at medium ranges where Japanese optical superiority would dominate. Everything from ship design to crew training to ammunition types was optimized for that specific scenario. The Iowa-class battleships were designed for operational flexibility. shore bombardment, carrier escort, surface action, anti-aircraft defense, night combat. Beyond visual range engagement. They weren't optimized for any single scenario because the American operational concept didn't assume they could choose the conditions of battle. This meant the Iowas were, in some ways, less specialized than the Yamatos. Their armor wasn't quite as thick, their guns weren't quite as large, but they were faster, more versatile, and crucially, they were backed by fire control systems that worked in conditions where Japanese systems became far less effective. The psychological impact on Japanese crews cannot be overstated. These were sailors who had trained for years, sometimes decades, believing their ships and their skills were superior. The early victories of 1941 and 42 had seemed to confirm this. Japanese naval aviation had devastated Pearl Harbor. Japanese surface forces had won stunning victories in night actions at Guadalcanal, but by 1944, the tide had turned. And part of what turned it was the realization that technological superiority mattered more than individual courage or training. A Japanese battleship gunner, in a post-war interview, described the creeping sense of futility. "We trained on our rangefinders until we could measure distances with precision. We practiced calculating firing solutions until we could do it in our sleep. But then we learned the Americans didn't need any of that. Their machines did it for them, faster, more accurately. At ranges we couldn't match. What good was our training against that?" This wasn't defeatism, it was brutal realism. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, Japanese naval strategy was in disarray. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine still nominally guided operations, but the circumstances it had envisioned no longer existed. American carriers were protected by fast battleships that couldn't be outmaneuvered or isolated. American fire control technology had created a range advantage Japanese systems couldn't overcome, and American industrial capacity meant that for every ship Japan lost, America could replace it with 3. The Iowa-class battleships prowled the Pacific as both weapons and symbols. Every appearance reinforced the same message. Japanese assumptions about naval warfare were obsolete. The decisive battle might still come, but if it did, it would be fought on American terms, at American ranges, using American technology that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. And somewhere in Tokyo, in the offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, officers were beginning to understand a terrible truth. They had built the largest, most heavily armed battleships in history, but they had built them for a war that was no longer being fought. The question became stark and unavoidable. What would happen when Japanese battleship crews, trained for decades in one form of warfare, finally encountered these American technological marvels in actual combat? The answer came in October of 1944, in the largest naval battle in history, Leyte Gulf. The Philippines had become the critical battleground. General Douglas MacArthur was making good on his promise to return. American amphibious forces were pouring ashore at Leyte, and the Japanese High Command recognized this as their last realistic chance to inflict a decisive defeat on the American fleet. Everything was committed. Every operational carrier, every available battleship and cruiser, every destroyer that could still make way. The plan was complex, involving multiple converging forces designed to trap and destroy the American landing fleet. But at its heart was the Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. This was the hammer, the decisive striking power that would smash through American defenses and devastate the vulnerable transports and supply ships supporting the landings. Center Force included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi. Their 18.1-inch guns had never fired at an enemy capital ship. For 3 years, these Leviathans had been held in reserve, too valuable to risk, waiting for the decisive battle that doctrine promised would come. Now, finally, they were being committed. The Kantai-Kessen was at hand. But the Americans had changed the rules of engagement. On October 24th, as Center Force navigated the Sibuyan Sea approaching the American fleet, they encountered what Japanese doctrine had never adequately prepared for. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft, not a handful of scouts or a single strike, hundreds of aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters, attack after attack, hour after hour, relentless and overwhelming. Musashi, the pride of the Japanese fleet, sister to Yamato, became the focus of concentrated assault. American pilots observed her enormous size, her heavy armor, and correctly identified her as the most dangerous target. They attacked with everything they had. Torpedoes struck her sides, bombs penetrated her deck, again and again and again. Musashi absorbed punishment that would have sunk any lesser ship immediately. 17 bomb hits, 19 torpedo hits. The reports vary, but the scale of damage was unprecedented. Her anti-aircraft defenses, which Japanese designers had believed would be adequate, proved hopelessly insufficient against massed American air attack. The Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft guns, manually aimed and hand-loaded, simply couldn't track or engage the number of targets swarming around the ship. American pilots noted that Japanese anti-aircraft fire was intense but not particularly accurate. The guns lacked the proximity-fused shells American ships carried. They lacked the radar-directed fire control that made American anti-aircraft batteries so deadly. By mid-afternoon, Musashi was doomed. Listing heavily to port, fires burning out of control, flooding in multiple compartments. At approximately 1930 hours, she capsized and sank, taking 1,023 of her 2,399-man crew with her. The irony was crushing. The second-largest battleship ever built, armed with the most powerful guns ever mounted on a warship, had been sunk without ever engaging an enemy surface vessel. Not by superior battleships in a gun duel, but by aircraft. By a weapon system that Japanese naval conservatives had resisted fully integrating into their doctrine. But Centreforce pressed on. Kurita still had Yamato, he still had heavy cruisers and battleships. The mission was too important to abandon. Through the San Bernardino Strait, into the Philippine Sea, toward the American landing beaches. What happened next has been debated by historians for decades, but the basic facts are undisputed. On the morning of October 25th, Centreforce encountered a group of American escort carriers and destroyers off Samar Island. This wasn't the American main fleet. These were the smallest, slowest carriers in the U.S. inventory, protected only by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. It should have been a massacre. Yamato's 18.1-inch guns against escort carriers with flight decks barely armored. Japanese heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns against destroyers armed with 5-inch mounts. On paper, the American force didn't stand a chance. But something went wrong for the Japanese. Catastrophically wrong. The engagement lasted over 2 hours. Yamato fired her massive guns at the fleeing American carriers. Other Japanese battleships and cruisers joined in. Hundreds of shells were expended. Heavy cruisers pursued at flank speed, closing to medium range where Japanese optical fire control should have been most effective. And yet, the escort carriers largely escaped. Several were damaged. One, USS Gambier Bay, was sunk, but the others survived, despite being chased by the most powerful surface force Japan had assembled. American destroyers, massively outgunned, launched desperate torpedo attacks that forced Japanese heavy ships to maneuver, breaking their pursuit. Smoke screens obscured visibility. Aggressive American tactics created confusion. But post-war analysis revealed something more troubling for Japanese naval theorists. The gunnery performance of Centreforce was shockingly poor. Hit percentages were far below what Japanese doctrine and training predicted. Shells fell short, or went long, or landed wide. Fire control seemed erratic. Target tracking was inconsistent. Part of this was the chaos of battle, but part of it, historians later concluded, was the inherent limitations of Japanese fire control systems when pushed beyond their design parameters. The manual input requirements, the lack of automated tracking, the reliance on optical range-finding in conditions of smoke, rain squalls, and maneuvering targets. American radar-directed 5-inch guns on the destroyers, by contrast, achieved hit after hit on Japanese heavy cruisers. These small guns, firing shells a fraction the weight of Yamato's projectiles, delivered accurate fire while the American ships maneuvered at high speed, launched torpedoes, and laid smoke screens. The fire control systems automatically compensated for ship motion, target motion, and ballistic variables. The technological gap wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was measurable in shells landed versus shells fired. One of the Japanese heavy cruisers, Chokai, was disabled and later sank from damage inflicted by 5-inch fire from American escort carriers. A cruiser, defeated by guns that weighed a fraction of what her own weapons did. But those guns were guided by Mark 37 fire control directors with integrated radar. They didn't need perfect visibility or stable firing platforms. They just worked. Vice Admiral Kurita, after 2 hours of confused action off Samar, made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. He ordered Centerforce to withdraw. The reasons are complex and still debated. Confusion about American force composition, fear of further air attacks, communications failures, exhaustion of his crews after days of relentless combat. But underlying all of it was a creeping realization that the decisive battle Japanese doctrine had promised wasn't unfolding as planned. His most powerful ships were expending enormous amounts of ammunition without achieving decisive results. American forces, though inferior on paper, were fighting with a ferocity and effectiveness that Japanese planning hadn't anticipated. And lurking somewhere beyond the horizon were the American fast battleships, the Iowa-class ships that could outrun his damaged force and bring those radar-directed 16-inch guns to bear. Kurita withdrew. Centerforce retreated through San Bernardino Strait. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended not with the decisive Japanese victory Kantai Kessen had promised, but with the destruction of Japanese naval aviation, the loss of multiple carriers, and the strategic collapse of Japan's ability to contest American dominance of the Philippine Sea. The psychological impact on Japanese battleship crews was profound. They had trained for years, they manned the most powerful battleships ever built. And yet, in the one major surface engagement where they had overwhelming superiority, they had failed to achieve decisive results. The Americans, meanwhile, emerged from Leyte Gulf with their confidence reinforced. The fast carrier task force concept worked, radar-directed gunnery worked, the integration of air power and surface combatants worked, and the Iowa-class battleships, though they hadn't engaged in the gun duel with Yamato that some had anticipated, had fulfilled their mission perfectly. They had screened the carriers, they had provided anti-aircraft defense, they had ensured that Japanese surface forces could never close with the vulnerable flat tops. By November of 1944, Japanese battleship doctrine was in ruins. Musashi was gone. Yamato had fired her guns in anger and achieved little. The decisive battle had happened, and Japan had lost, not through one crushing defeat, but through a series of engagements that demonstrated American superiority in almost every dimension that mattered. The Iowa-class battleships now turned their attention to a different mission, one that would demonstrate their 16-inch guns' destructive power in ways that Japanese defenders found even more demoralizing than ship-to-ship combat. Shore bombardment. The island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific required massive pre-invasion bombardments to suppress Japanese coastal defenses. Concrete bunkers, artillery positions, command posts, airfields, supply depots. All had to be systematically destroyed before American Marines and soldiers could storm ashore. This was where the Iowa class truly demonstrated their value, not in the decisive battleship duel Japanese doctrine had envisioned, but in sustained, methodical destruction of shore targets from ranges Japanese coastal guns couldn't match. Iwo Jima, February of 1945. Before the Marines landed, Iowa-class battleships joined other American battleships in bombarding the island. The 16-inch guns fired the Mark 13 high-capacity shells. Each 1,900-pound projectile contained hundreds of pounds of high explosive. Upon impact, they created craters 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The blast could defoliate trees 400 yards from impact point. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima had prepared elaborate defenses, concrete bunkers with walls several feet thick, artillery positions dug into volcanic rock, interconnected tunnels and firing positions designed to withstand bombardment. American planners knew these defenses were formidable. What the Japanese defenders hadn't fully anticipated was the sheer volume and accuracy of fire American battleships could deliver. Day after day of bombardment, thousands of shells, not random fire, but carefully plotted, radar-directed targeting of specific positions identified through aerial reconnaissance and intelligence. One Japanese survivor, interviewed after the war, described the bombardment as the Earth itself trying to kill us. The concussion from 16-inch shells landing nearby was enough to cause internal injuries, even in protected bunkers. The noise was deafening. The psychological pressure was relentless. Day turned to night in the smoke and dust. Then night erupted with flashes as more shells arrived, and the Japanese guns couldn't effectively return fire. American battleships fired from ranges of 20,000 yards or more, well beyond the effective reach of most coastal artillery. When Japanese guns did fire back, American ships simply repositioned, their speed and maneuverability allowing them to shift firing positions faster than Japanese artillery could adjust. The radar fire control meant American ships could maintain accurate fire even when obscured by their own gun smoke. Japanese optical fire control required clear sight lines. American fire control just needed a radar return. Okinawa, April of 1945. The last and bloodiest of the Pacific Island campaigns, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin joined the pre-invasion bombardment. The scale of fire was staggering. Missouri alone fired over 500 rounds of 16-inch ammunition during the preliminary bombardment and subsequent fire support missions. Japanese defenders on Okinawa had months to prepare. They had studied American tactics at previous invasions. They knew the bombardment was coming. They built deeper bunkers, more elaborate tunnels, better concealed positions. It didn't matter. The sheer weight of American naval gunfire overwhelmed even the most carefully prepared defenses. Ammunition dumps exploded in massive secondary detonations. Artillery positions were buried under tons of rubble. Communication lines were severed. Command and control broke down under the relentless pounding. A Japanese artillery officer on Okinawa later wrote in his diary, discovered after the battle, "The American guns fire, without pause. We cannot return fire effectively because we cannot see the ships. Our positions are destroyed one by one. There is nothing we can do except dig deeper and hope to survive." This was the reality of modern naval gunfire support, not the romantic vision of battleship versus battleship combat, but industrial-scale destruction delivered with scientific precision against targets that couldn't effectively fight back. American Marines landing on Okinawa's beaches reported that pre-invasion bombardment had been so effective that initial resistance was lighter than expected. The Japanese had been forced to abandon many coastal positions, their guns destroyed, their bunkers collapsed, their defenders killed or forced into deeper defensive positions inland. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese military leadership, monitoring reports from various island garrisons, began to understand that American naval gunfire support was creating an insurmountable problem. Even the most determined defenders, willing to fight to the last man, were being systematically destroyed before ground combat even began, and there was no effective countermeasure. Japan's naval aviation had been largely destroyed. Kamikaze attacks could sometimes damage or sink American ships, but they couldn't suppress naval gunfire support missions conducted from beyond visual range. Coastal artillery was outranged and outgunned. The only defense was to dig deeper, hide better, and hope to survive the preliminary bombardment. But survival meant emerging from collapsed bunkers and damaged positions to face fresh American troops supported by armor, artillery, and continued naval gunfire. The bombardments weren't just destroying defenses, they were destroying morale. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the summer of 1945, Japanese battleship crews were facing a grim reality. Yamato was still afloat, but fuel shortages kept her largely confined to port. The decisive battle doctrine that had justified her construction had proven to be fantasy. American carrier aviation dominated the seas. American battleships provided overwhelming fire support to amphibious operations. and Japanese surface forces had been reduced to scattered remnants, unable to contest American naval supremacy in any meaningful way. In April of 1945, Yamato was sent on her final mission, Operation Ten-Go, a one-way suicide attack against American forces at Okinawa. The plan was desperate and operationally incoherent. Yamato, with minimal fuel and escorted by a handful of destroyers, would steam toward Okinawa, beach herself, and use her 18.1-inch guns as shore batteries until she was destroyed. It was an admission of total defeat. The most powerful battleship ever built, reduced to a glorified coastal artillery platform in a mission that had virtually no chance of success. Yamato never reached Okinawa. American submarines tracked her departure, scout planes shadowed her progress, and on April 7, 1945, American carrier aircraft found her south of Kyushu. What followed was a repeat of Musashi's fate, but even more one-sided. Wave after wave of American aircraft, torpedo bombers attacking from both sides to prevent Yamato from turning into the torpedo tracks, dive bombers targeting her decks and superstructure. The anti-aircraft fire was intense but ineffective. Modern American aircraft were simply too fast, too numerous, too well coordinated. Yamato took at least 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits, possibly more. Her list increased until the ship could no longer be controlled. At 14:23 hours, approximately 2 hours after the first attacks began, Yamato's forward magazines exploded. The detonation was visible from 160 kilometers away. A mushroom cloud rose over 6 kilometers into the sky. Of Yamato's crew of 3,332, only 276 survived. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito and Captain Kosaku Aruga both chose to go down with the ship. The symbolism was inescapable. The ultimate expression of the Kantai-Kessen doctrine, the ship built to win the decisive battle, had been destroyed by carrier aircraft without ever engaging an enemy battleship. The doctrine that had guided Japanese naval planning for 4 decades had led to this, a futile suicide mission that achieved nothing except the loss of Japan's last operational super battleship. Meanwhile, the Iowa-class battleships continued operations across the Pacific. In July of 1945, they participated in direct bombardments of the Japanese home islands. These weren't targeting remote island garrisons. These were attacks on Japanese soil itself. On the night of July 14th to 15th, USS Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, along with other battleships and cruisers, bombarded the Nihon Steel Company and Wanishi Iron Works at Muroran, Hokkaido. Over 2,500 houses were destroyed by secondary fires. The psychological impact was devastating. American battleships were firing on Japan itself, and there was nothing Japanese forces could do to stop them. Admiral Halsey later stated that the bombardments showed the Japanese, "We made no bones about playing in his front yard." The Japanese War Minister was forced to formally apologize for the inability to stop Third Fleet's attacks. A second bombardment on the night of July 17th to 18th targeted Hitachi on the coast of Honshu, only 80 nautical miles from Tokyo. USS Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Alabama pounded industrial targets while Japanese defenders watched helplessly. Coastal batteries returned fire but scored no hits. The American ships were too fast, too maneuverable, and their radar-directed guns were too accurate. For Japanese military leadership, these bombardments represented the complete collapse of national defense. The most powerful navy in Japanese history had been swept from the seas. The home islands themselves were being shelled by American battleships operating with impunity. The war was lost, and everyone knew it. On September 2, 1945, the instrument of Japanese surrender was signed aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The choice of venue was deliberate. An Iowa-class battleship, the newest and most powerful class of American battleships, floating in sight of the Japanese capital. The symbolism couldn't be missed. Japanese officials boarded Missouri's deck, walked past the 16-inch gun turrets, and formally surrendered to representatives of the Allied powers. The war that had begun with Japanese confidence in the Kantai-Kessen doctrine ended under the shadow of American battleships that had rendered that doctrine obsolete. The comparison between Yamato and Iowa became a case study in contrasting approaches to naval warfare. Yamato was larger, more heavily armored, and carried bigger guns. On paper, in a theoretical one-on-one duel under perfect conditions, she might have prevailed. But wars aren't fought on paper, or under perfect conditions. They're fought across thousands of miles of ocean, in all weather, at all hours, against multiple threats. And in that real-world environment, the Iowa-class battleships were simply more effective. Speed mattered more than maximum armor. Versatility mattered more than single-purpose optimization. Integrated fire control systems mattered more than the largest guns. Industrial capacity to build multiple ships mattered more than putting all resources into 2 super battleships. Japanese battleship crews, in post-war interviews, often expressed a kind of confused respect for American technology. They had trained on what they believed were superior systems. Their optical rangefinders were excellent. Their manual fire control calculations were precise. Their dedication and skill were unquestionable. But skill couldn't overcome systemic technological inferiority. A Japanese rangefinder operator, no matter how well trained, couldn't see through fog or darkness. A manual fire control computer, no matter how precisely operated, couldn't calculate solutions as quickly as an automated analog computer with radar input. Human eyesight, no matter how sharp, couldn't match radar's ability to track targets beyond the horizon. One Japanese naval officer, in a 1950 interview, put it bluntly. "We trained for the war we expected. The Americans prepared for the war they got. That made all the difference." The legacy of the Iowa-class battleships extended far beyond World War II. They were recalled for the Korean War, providing naval gunfire support that proved devastating to North Korean and Chinese positions. In 1968, USS New Jersey was reactivated for service off Vietnam, where her 16-inch guns again demonstrated their effectiveness in shore bombardment missions. Most remarkably, all 4 Iowa-class battleships were reactivated in the 1980s as part of the 600-ship Navy initiative. Modernized with Tomahawk cruise missiles, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, and Phalanx close-in weapon systems, they proved that well-designed battleships could remain relevant even in the missile age. During the 1991 Gulf War, USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin fired both Tomahawk missiles and 16-inch shells at Iraqi targets. Wisconsin served as a Tomahawk strike coordinator, proving that a World War II-era battleship could host modern command and control roles. The 16-inch guns provided sustained fire support that precision missiles couldn't match for sheer volume and immediate responsiveness. By the time the last Iowa-class battleship was decommissioned in 1992, they had served in combat across 5 decades. No other battleship class in history could claim such longevity. No other battleships had fired their guns in anger from World War II through the Gulf War. Today, all 4 Iowa-class battleships are preserved as museum ships: USS Iowa in Los Angeles, USS New Jersey in Camden, New Jersey, USS Missouri in Pearl Harbor, appropriately moored near the USS Arizona Memorial, linking the beginning and end of America's Pacific War, USS Wisconsin in Norfolk, Virginia. Visitors walk their decks, examine the 16-inch gun turrets, and try to imagine what it must have been like when those cannons roared. Tour guides explain the radar systems, the fire control computers, the engineering that made these ships possible, and occasionally, elderly Japanese naval veterans visit these museums. They stand on the decks of the ships they once feared and hated. They examine the technology that defeated them, and they acknowledge, with the perspective of decades, that these battleships represented something more than just naval power. They represented a fundamental transformation in warfare, the shift from human skill and courage as the primary determinants of victory to systematic technological advantage as the decisive factor. The change from warfare as individual combat to warfare as industrial process. The Iowa-class battleships didn't just defeat Japanese battleships in combat, they made the entire concept of the decisive battleship, duel obsolete. They proved that future naval warfare would be fought by integrated systems, carrier task forces, radar-directed weapons, and industrial capacity, not by individual ships in one climactic engagement. For Japanese battleship crews, the lesson was painful and clear. Their training had been excellent, their dedication was unquestionable, their ships were magnificent, but they had been prepared to fight the previous war, while the Americans had invented a new one. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine had promised that Japan could win through one decisive battle fought on favorable terms. The reality was that the Americans never allowed those favorable terms to develop. They fought at night, in weather, beyond visual range, with integrated systems that Japanese doctrine hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter. Every thunderous broadside from an Iowa-class battleship's 16-inch guns carried a message that Japanese naval leadership finally understood by 1945. The age of the battleship duel was over. The war would be won by industrial capacity, technological innovation, and operational flexibility. And in all three categories, America held overwhelming advantages that Japanese courage and skill couldn't overcome. The 2,700-pound Mark 8 armor-piercing shells that Iowa-class battleships fired weren't just weapons, they were symbols. Each one represented American industrial might. Each one demonstrated technological superiority. Each one reinforced the reality that Japanese assumptions about naval warfare had been catastrophically wrong. Japanese battleship crews never expected Iowa-class 16-inch guns to fire 2,700-pound shells, 24 miles, with radar-directed accuracy in darkness, fog, and beyond visual range. They had trained for a different kind of warfare. They had expected battles fought at medium range in daylight, where their superior optics and crew skill would prevail. Instead, they encountered a new paradigm. Ships that could see without seeing. Guns that could hit without optical rangefinders. Fire control systems that didn't depend on human vision or manual calculation. It was like bringing swords to a gunfight, except the gunfight was happening from over the horizon, and the swordsmen didn't even know they were under attack until the shells started landing. The story of the Iowa-class battleships versus Japanese naval doctrine isn't primarily about ships or technology. It's about assumptions. About preparing for the war you expect versus adapting to the war you get. About the danger of doctrine that becomes dogma. Japanese naval planning from 1905 to 1945 remained fundamentally unchanged. Build powerful battleships. Train excellent crews, wait for the decisive battle, win through superior fighting spirit and skill. It had worked against Russia in 1905. Surely it would work again. But warfare had changed. Technology had changed. The Americans had changed the rules. And Japanese doctrine, for all its elegance and historical validation, couldn't adapt quickly enough. The Iowa-class battleships represented something revolutionary. Not just better battleships, but a different concept of what battleships were for and how they should fight. Fast enough to escort carriers, powerful enough to devastate shore targets, sophisticated enough to engage in radar-directed combat beyond visual range, numerous enough that losing one wasn't catastrophic. Japanese super battleships represented perfection of a dying paradigm, the ultimate expression of battleship as decisive weapon, so powerful that they couldn't be risked, so valuable that they spent the war in port, so specialized that when they finally entered combat, they were ill-suited for the actual conditions they encountered. The irony is profound. Japan built the largest, most powerful battleships in history. America built slightly smaller, slightly less armed battleships. But the American ships fought in every major campaign, provided crucial support to countless operations, and remained relevant for 5 decades. The Japanese ships spent most of the war in port, achieved little in combat, and were destroyed without ever fulfilling their intended purpose. Technology mattered, but it wasn't just about having radar or better guns. It was about integrated systems thinking, about designing ships to fulfill actual operational requirements rather than theoretical ideals, about flexibility over specialization, about accepting that no single weapon system, no matter how powerful, could win a modern industrial war. The Japanese battleship crews who survived the war had to process a difficult truth. Everything they had been taught was wrong, not because their teachers were incompetent or dishonest, but because the fundamental assumptions underlying their doctrine had been overtaken by technological and strategic evolution. The Iowa-class 16-inch guns firing 2,700-pound shells 24 miles weren't just weapons defeating other weapons. They were the future defeating the past. They were systematic innovation defeating traditional excellence. They were the brutal reality that in modern warfare, the better system beats the better warrior. For those who study military history, the lesson remains relevant. Doctrine is necessary, training is crucial, skill and courage matter. But none of them can substitute for clear-eyed assessment of actual conditions, willingness to adapt, and understanding that the enemy gets a vote in how the war will be fought. Japanese battleship crews never expected what hit them, and that, ultimately, was the problem. Expectation had become assumption, assumption had become doctrine, and doctrine had become inflexible dogma that couldn't survive contact with reality. The thunder of Iowa-class guns echoes through history, not just as the sound of American victory, but as a reminder that wars are won by those who adapt fastest to changing conditions, not by those who perfect yesterday's solutions to yesterday's problems. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.